Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, still with a broken webcam today, and I'm joined by Sara. Sara, how are you doing?
I think the only thing that's really working well right now is my webcam.
Yes, no, it's been a week of technical problems for me in particular, but hopefully they'll be sorted next week. Anyway, a Friday of just the two of us talking about all the wild and wacky things going on in the country. So let's get started with that. And I think the first thing we're going to talk about here is some questions one of our colleagues has asked of government. One of our researchers, Chris Patterson, sent a letter to the Commission on Employment Equity, asking them some very basic questions about racial classification. Of course, as anyone who follows government policy at all knows, a significant amount of legislation in South Africa is based around what race you are, right? Particularly with terms of getting preferential treatment in education, in procurement, and various other things. But this kind of makes one ask the question, what exactly does it mean to belong to a certain race? So Chris asked, quote, can the Commission provide specific and detailed information of the definition of the A, African, B, Indian, and C, colored groups contained within the broader definition of Black people referred to in the Employment Equity Act and its annual reports? Patterson says that this is kind of the language is a bit vague and that this is all sort of a generic term. And the response was, shall we say, a bit of a dodge. The Commission was unable to actually define what it meant by these different racial groups. So, Sara, I mean, this is, I think, one of the great sort of pillars in the middle of the kind of BEE system of policy that has always been a little bit shaky, is like, how do you define these racial groups? One might be tempted to say something like, oh, well, we just mean that if under apartheid you were classified as one of these race groups, then you qualify for BEE. But of course, one of the problems with that is that it simply reintroduces racial classification as we had under apartheid, one of the great crimes of the previous government. So I don't know. What do you make of this?
Well, essentially, it was the great crime of the apartheid government because it was the foundational measure against which absolutely everything happened from 1948 onwards, was that definition. And it led to the sort of highly bizarre social engineering that inevitably had to come out of those definitions. I mean, there was an example given recently of, at various points during apartheid, people were reclassified from one group into another group, from another group back into one group, and then into a third group. And despite which, the Population Registration Act is not on the book. So saying that it refers to people who were previously, quote, disadvantaged, not only does it's referring back to the worst possible legislation by implication. Secondly, it's actually, there's nothing in law that defines the groups, and it's basically saying, well, you kind of figure it out based on what happened in the past, and it takes, even if that's all they're doing, and by all accounts that really is all they're doing, it doesn't take account of the fact that things don't change. But what it does suggest is they're basing an attempt to sort of gerrymander, if that's the right term, society as a whole. It's to work by a yardstick that doesn't exist biologically, when you could much more easily decide what legislation should benefit people based on their particular circumstances. And basically anyone whose circumstances were, shall we call them, generally previously disadvantaged, will make up the bulk of people who will need to be supported, who may need to be supported, or whatever the case may be. But it will also mean that there will be people who were otherwise considered, in old terminology, white, who will be currently in very dire straits. But it's not as if the ability to help and assist people to move up in the world within the limitations of government action, cannot be applied. It's fair. You're looking at people's means, and one
Right,
way or the other,
exactly.
the government's got to help the private sector to improve those means.
Exactly, and that's the sort of bizarreness of this. So for a long time, us at the IRR have advocated for a system, as you say, where whether you get preferential treatment in various spheres is based off of your sort of your means and your income, all that kind of thing. Because under the current system, in theory, you're going to have people. Well, not in theory. In reality, you have people who have grown up often in sometimes in very privileged backgrounds. I'm thinking of kids whose parents may have gone to private school. I'm thinking specifically here of the kids of maybe senior ANC leaders, or you could have a child who's let's say his mother is white and his father is black, and he's technically mixed race, but he's grown up entirely in what we might call a quote unquote white upbringing. Who would then qualify for BE? It doesn't make any sense. The only thing that makes sense is if you actually test people, as you say, test people's means, what they actually live under, what circumstances they come from. Did they get a good education? Are they living in poverty? That kind of thing. And if you actually look at that stuff, you can begin to focus helping people who really need it rather than enriching people who are already politically connected and have the sort of already have a leg up over most of the population.
And just to sort of to add to a comment on that, there is something quite disturbing about 30 years after democracy. You're essentially saying, we believe that 80% of the population needs assistance, and having no regard to the fact that the growth of the middle class and the upper classes, black middle and upper classes, has happened, has been significant, and that the gap economically between black, upper class, middle class, and poor is wider than the gap if you compare a black lower class to a white middle and upper class. So there have been changes, but after 30 years, the changes shouldn't revolve around essentially a few tens of thousands of people, maybe a few hundreds of thousands of people. It's about getting people into a situation where they can start really making progress in terms of what they know they need or perceive they need or capable of achieving to improve their lot in life. And
right,
to go, essentially what they're saying is, look at the color of somebody's skin. And we know, and perhaps mixed marriage is a perfect example to negate all of that messing around. Is mixed families, mixed race families. What you literally see cannot be assumed to be what you get. I mean, and within to categorize people on a basic, let's be honest, what appears to be purely physical characteristic is societally, I think, obscene.
Right, exactly. I mean, one of the central madnesses of the kind of BE regime has been essentially the idea that it's more important that we have a number of black billionaires than it is that we end poverty in South Africa. And there's sort of this kind of inbuilt but never mentioned assumption that if there are black billionaires, somehow there will be some sort of social change that uplifts life of the rest of the population. But of course, it never happens, because empowering a small group of politically connected people at the expense of productivity in the majority of the country is just a short road to nowhere, as we've seen by our anemic growth rates over the last 20 years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, why not work at uplifting more rather than less? And particularly in circumstances where those who have gained more should be in a position to manage, really control their own lives and their own futures. And I would have thought, in a way, the extent to which this is demeaning would be unassailable.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, there's this kind of, sort of assumption out there that some in the kind of ANC's orbit might say, well, we have to implement BE because it's what our it's what our people demand. Well, it's not really. When you actually ask South Africans whether they would rather have businesses that create jobs or businesses that are black owned, people say we want businesses that are creating jobs. And in fact, we don't care about the color of their skin. Same for when you ask people about what the race of the teachers teaching their kids should be. There is a group of South Africans who do believe they want racial engineering more importantly than their outcomes, but that's less than 20% of the population, or around about 20% of the population. In fact, the Social Research Foundation polling, which was released this month, shows that most South Africans of all races believe that government appointments should be based on merit, not race. This matches polling that we at the IRR have done, and not just us at the IRR and people at the Social Research Foundation, but basically all polling done by reputable firms in the country over the last couple of decades has found that South Africans, by and large, are not nearly as attached to racial laws as politicians would have you believe.
Well, I think it's as basically simple as this. People know that their needs are to be met by the people who are capable of helping them meet their needs, and that's essentially what merit is about. And in any event, given the fact that whites really are very much, they're an under 10% grouping in this country, it's just a matter of reality that not every job that theoretically could or should be open only to black people can be filled by white people. They just aren't there, and it's not as if the lack of skills, which is critical for South Africa, is entirely a South African phenomenon. So the need for merit and the need for skills, everyone needs it. And why do they need it? They need it because these are people who can create the environment that makes growth more feasible and therefore empowers people to move up the social ladder.
Definitely. Okay, let's move on to our next story. And this is an interesting little political development. I mean, it's difficult to know about the exact importance of this, but I think it is perhaps a signpost on the direction in which the country's politics is going. ANC veteran Willies Mchunu, who was formerly a premier in KwaZulu-Natal and was also the chairperson of the South African Communist Party in KwaZulu-Natal, has decided to leave the ANC publicly. He resigned because he said that while he initially accepted the formation of the Government of National Unity and the Government of Provincial Unity in KZN, he felt he could no longer add value to the party and that he disagreed with the direction the party was taking. He was also very upset about how some of his colleagues in the ANC had attacked him. He said, quote, "I was labeled to the effect that I am politically ignorant and don't know what communism is. In one provincial executive committee meeting, I was reliably informed. I was questioned by my leaders as to who I am to tell leadership what to do in the matter." He also said that, quote, "I have discovered with horror that I have lost hope in the ANC's commitment and ability to pursue the national democratic revolution in the interests of the working class and the poor in its current trajectory. The helplessness, in my view, was neither good for me or the party. It makes me see myself as a destructive member of the ANC rather than a member dedicated to the strengthening of the party." And he therefore is resigning from the party. The ANC's provincial secretary in the province, Beki Motolo, said that it was with great pain that they saw him go, but then pushed back by saying that the GNU was nothing new. Motolo said, quote, "If my memory serves me well, subject to correction, the GNU between 1994 and 1999 had parties such as the National Party, which from 1948 at least was responsible for the most murders and tortures of many of our comrades. During this period, tensions in relations between the ANC and IFP were at their lowest. Incidents were happening across the province where comrades were losing their lives. At no point did the comrades who participated in the IFP-led GPU withdraw from it or leave the ANC. They continued to serve." So, Sara, I guess the takeaway from this is it does seem to me, at least within the KZN ANC, such as what is left of it, because it's not nearly as big as it used to be, that the anti-GNU side is losing. You usually don't quit the party if you think you're going to win back power in it. What do you make of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, isn't it a funny way of finding some positive news that somebody who insists that he does understand what communism is and that it's the route to follow in progressing the NDR to the point of that ultimate utopia, it isn't working. He says it's not working in the ANC anymore, and we should be delighted if that possibly could be true. I mean, I'm not sure that is entirely true, but that is part of the problem as to why, our outlook for economic growth is so modest. But I suppose any sign that the devotees to communism are unhappy with the performance of the ANC, we should welcome. The only problem is that the breakaways from the ANC, like the EFF and MK, either don't actually have an ideology in mind, whether it's of any kind other than taking power and ruining the country. So perhaps he's going off to join that. Maybe he sees that as part of the National Democratic Revolution to take you to a utopia which A, will not exist, and B, will not exist. And that is utopia for you. But I think it's also, perhaps, in fairness, it's also about looking at watching a generation that was wedded, and to some extent is still wedded to that idea of communism as a solution, and it's actually dying out. It's getting older. It is going, and it is necessary that it goes. To what extent it will be placed by something more pragmatic, I don't know. But there's no doubt the ANC is caught between its love affair with an ideology that was reflected of its glory days, and the very real realization, certainly at national level, and although I think they're very uncertain about it, and that's why they're letting Gauteng sort of drift its own way, that their survival, and they must have their survival in mind, depends on actually achieving something for the people of the country, for the people, not for the party. And I think that that sort of almost hopeless romanticism has been mugged a little bit by reality. But, we know we've got a hell of an unpredictable way to go. Gauteng has been at the receiving end, both Tshwane and provincially. So maybe it's a good sign, but I don't think it matters all that much. He per se doesn't matter at this stage, to be quite honest. But yeah, there's a kind of pathetic sadness in all of this that, he's the fact that he's leaving for this reason suggests that maybe we can be hopeful, but we can't yet trust that we can be hopeful. So we're sort of trying to balance it a bit.
Yeah, no. So this is the problem, I think, with the ANC right now, is it's not being honest with the conversation it needs to have with itself. So defenders of the government of national unity have often defended it along sort of national democratic revolution and communist lines. I think it's the Minister of Housing wrote a piece basically saying that going into the government of national unity was essentially a strategic retreat, a little bit like Mao Zedong's Long March or Lenin's New Economic Plan. What the ANC needs to realize is that every time it has moved away from these hardline communist ideals, it has been more successful and more popular. It was during the presidency of Thabo Mbeki, when it was at its furthest ever from some of these ideals during the GEAR program, that the ANC got 69% of the vote and saw economic growth of 4 or 5%. Yeah. Now the ANC has gone back into government with sort of non-communist parties like the Freedom Front Plus, the DA, etc. And that once again, market sentiment is up. The party's popularity is, according to the poll from the SRF, is starting to grow again, and things are looking up for it. And yet, it still can't admit that actually the party needs to abandon some of these old ideas. Now, to be fair, Fikile Mbalula has suggested that the ANC is in fact a social democratic party rather than a communist one. Which is a bit at odds with everything the ANC's been saying, for since the 60s at least. But, that is a step in the right direction. But as I said, they're just not being honest that the central argument in their party is where is not being had, is that they actually need to abandon some of these old ideas they've been clinging to desperately.
Well, the funny thing is, it's you watch the ANC follow the ideological track, but the people follow the pragmatic track. You know, in the, as you say, the Mbeki years, people respond to improvements they see, and there's no doubt in many respects there were in those first 10 years considerable considerable improvements, but it's literally, you see that you do get that pragmatic response of what do we need, and the ANC goes, you need the old white communist thinkers of the 19th century who never spent a day working in a factory or suffering the conditions of the Industrial Revolution. Hell, it doesn't work. But as I said, the biggest problem at the moment is the ANC isn't getting to grips with it, and it's their future that may hinge more on it than anybody else's.
No, exactly. And you know, we've actually seen that. I mean, the SRF polling, we talked about it yesterday, but one of the really fascinating things in it is that a majority of South Africans of all races believe that it was very important that the EFF and MK were kept out of power. And you know, if the ANC is not taking a hint from that, they really should. Anyway, all right, let's go on to our next story very briefly. I don't know how much there is to say about this one, but this is, I think, a pretty good development. So we've talked a lot on the show about how the National Health Insurance Act is a very serious threat to the well-being of the country and is very likely to, in particular, I think, drive the middle class out of South Africa if it is fully implemented. It was passed into law just before the election by President Ramaphosa, but there has been some talk of maybe sort of moderating it a little bit. However, Health Minister Aaron Motsoaledi and his main bureaucrat, Dr. Nicholas Crisp, have very aggressively pushed back on any efforts to moderate the NHI and have gone sort of full steam ahead. Well, Trade Union Solidarity has been taking the government to court on a whole bunch of problems with the NHI. They say it's unconstitutional, for example, that the NHI essentially bans private medical aid in most instances. And so far, the government is really struggling to file its court papers in response to this challenge. They've missed a number of deadlines, and they're asking for yet another deadline extension so that they can, deal with all of these issues. However, Solidarity wants to go forward and say that this court case should be heard unopposed because the government has taken so long to reply with its court documents. Quite embarrassing for the government here, but I do wonder whether this means that NHI is going to be gutted in the courts. Do you think we can hope for that, Sara?
Well, so far the omens have been good in the sense that the cases that revolved around the certificate of need in the highest courts has not come down on the side of the government on constitutional grounds, and there are so many constitutional issues to raise in this case. The problem for the government is that it's put the NHI on the table probably about 15 years ago. So if anyone should know what the answers or the response to an allegation of unconstitutionality should be, and you mentioned Messrs. Motsoaledi and Crisp, it is them. So if they can argue that what Solidarity is submitting is either factually and legally wrong or impermissible, they should have been. I don't say it's not complicated, but I think the problem is that the failure to address certain very paramount issues in NHI, not least of which is having never costed it or done any form of other audit as to its feasibility as proposed, that faced with having to actually answer the questions in a formal legal environment, it's damn difficult because they're wrong. And the legislation is very much open to attack. I've lost track of, the likelihood of any further extensions on this sort of matter likely to be given. But can you imagine if the case actually proceeds at this point with only one set of papers in? I mean, they could have quietly sat on the NHI and let the GNU run and done nothing. But in heralding it just before the election, and with Motsoaledi and Chris coming out aggressively for it and clearly showing their undemocratic, illogical, and really harmful approach to this whole thing, maybe the government will be able to blame the courts for the fact that they were let off the hook. I mean, that one would never have thought that that would be the way in which the NHR might slowly grind to a halt, but maybe that'll be the way.
Look, I don't believe this is what Ramaphosa is doing, because I don't think there's any track record to suggest that he is purposely screwing up the legal defense here. But if he was, this would be the funniest and most devious way I could possibly imagine to destroy NHI. And yeah, I sincerely hope. Yeah, exactly. Oh, it wasn't us. It was the evil courts. I think, yeah, no, I think that would be very funny. Although, I just can't see Ramaphosa doing that. But it's not completely outside the bounds of possibility, I suppose. Let's go on very briefly to our next story, and this is about Durban, which, like many municipalities in Gauteng, is facing a water crisis. In fact, it's far advanced in that water crisis ahead of Gauteng. And it looks like there's now some sort of proper response from the mayor. As to the quality of this response, I can't attest, but this at least sounds like, there's some serious choices being made now. The mayor of eThekwini, that is the municipality around Durban, has ordered a gradual reduction in the consumption of water over the next 12 months, and that they would be basically reducing water supply to residents over the next 12 months in order to make sure that they had enough water in the event that there was a drought or any kind of shortfall of how much water was coming into the system. He also said the city would employ various interventions, including installation of restrictions in all customers' water meters, pressure reduction in reticulation networks, metering all unmetered customers, improving turnaround times when repairing leaks and pipe bursts, community education on water conservation, disconnection of illegal connections, and water rationing when demand is too high or exceeds supply. But clearly going to be a very stressful, unpleasant time for the citizens of eThekwini. Of course, on paper, this sounds like a system that could be manageable, but it only takes a couple of small mistakes to, for example, cut people off from water for 2 weeks if they, live too high or too close to the reservoir. The Department of Water and the city said that the city had spent 110 million rand so far on 2 pipe replacement programs, and that they plan to do a lot more. And the head of water and sanitation in the city boasted that the city had made significant progress in reducing water losses from 58% at the end of the last financial year to 54%, which is an improvement, but not an enormous one. At this rate, to get it to a much more manageable number, it's going to take quite a long time, a time which eThekwini does not have. Yeah. What do you make of this, Sara?
Look, I think the problem was obviously preceded by load shedding, but the problem with water is that it's the provision of water that you can't easily replicate it at any level, but at a sort of the odd suburban borehole level. So the pressure is really, really on local and provincial governments. And perhaps the tragedy of it both there and in Gauteng is that if anything had to be maintained and watched, like increasing populations as South Africa has urbanized to a majority state of urbanization, no longer a majority rural population, it is the provision of water. And it really just says that they're going to need to rely on skills wherever they may come from and, get those who can assist from the private sector in to do it without restrictions on what they do, how they do it, and what whether they have sort of a contract that's only 2 minutes long or not. It's crucial to educate the public about what needs to be done, but I think in a way that is actually going to be the most difficult, because just instinctively people are used to being able to turn on their taps and get the water they need, and that re-education I think is going to be, it's crucial, but I think it's much more difficult than is anticipated. So
yes,
we're going to have to grit our teeth a lot in the next few years.
yes, no, definitely. And I think the residents of Joburg need to, and Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, all these cities need to also be prepared for potentially down the line dealing with the same thing, because it looks like the problems in Gauteng are much further away from being fixed even than in Durban.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Sara, very much for being on the show with me and holding down the fort when we were missing another. And thank you, everyone, for watching. We hope you enjoyed the show, found it interesting. And we will, of course, be back on Monday with the Daily Friend Show. Hopefully, our tech problems will be sorted by then. Anyway, cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.